Hey guys, how you doing? We're at Sister Giant in Washington, D.C. You can tell by the drums in the background. No, we're going to talk to Ari Berman here. Ari writes for The Nation, among other publications, and he's got a new book, Give Us the Ballot. Well, that would be nice. So, Ari, let's just start with this. What do you mean, give us the ballot?
Well, Give Us the Ballot was the first major speech that Martin Luther King gave about voting rights in 1957. So it was kind of the jumping off point for me to think about this. But the book was really about the history of the Voting Rights Act. So what the Voting Rights Act did, how it transformed American democracy, but how there's been a 50-year effort to roll back voting rights and to roll back the Voting Rights Act. And these efforts have really reached a fever pitch with the Republican Party and Donald Trump today.
So do you think Donald Trump's gambit about all the illegal voters is an calculated plan to roll back voting rights under the guise of voter fraud?
I do. I don't think Trump himself is that sophisticated, but I think Republicans have been promoting the myth of voter fraud precisely so they can launch new voter suppression efforts. They can say, well, there's all this talk about voter fraud. They're the ones who, of course, are talking about it, right? So you say it enough times, voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud, people start to believe it, and they say, oh, well, we need to keep this person from voting, and that person from voting, and that person from voting, and suddenly African Americans, Latinos, students, it's a lot more difficult for them to vote.
So how could Democrats or progressives fight back against that? Because you know how the media is, they'll call it even, right?
Yeah.
And they call it even all the time. Now, to be fair to them, they did a great job pointing out that Donald Trump was lying about the 3 to 5 million people voting illegally, which is actually something I haven't seen the media do in as long as I've been alive. But overall, how do you, because they have this thing of, hey, I have a driver's license, why don't they just get a driver's license, and et cetera. How do you fight back effectively against it?
So the media did a good job of fact-checking Trump, but they didn't take the next step, which is say voter fraud is largely a myth, but voter suppression is very real, and that's the problem that we should be focusing on. So people don't even know there is a suppression problem. They don't even know that people are being prevented or it's being made harder for them to vote, and so I think you have to say, well, yeah, 90% of the population does have an ID for voting. But for the 10% that don't, it's very burdensome. When there are 5-hour lines to vote, lots of people are impacted by that. When it's harder to do voter registration, when the League of Women Voters can't register people, that affects voters all across the political spectrum. And we can't call ourselves a democracy and then have a situation over and over and over again when not everyone's vote is being counted.
Well, I mean, already we had voter suppression in every way, let alone in North Carolina, where it was very, very significant, but also in the states that mattered, like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. And so in those states, you just had 78,000 votes that swung the election, and the weather could swing an election when it's that narrow a margin. So voter suppression might have already worked to get Trump in the White House.
Well, I think it had an impact. I was in Wisconsin on Election Day, and 300,000 registered voters there, according to a federal court, didn't have strict forms of voter ID, and they had one of the strictest voter ID laws in the country. And Trump only won Wisconsin by about 20,000 votes, and we know turnout was down significantly in Milwaukee, where many people were impacted. Were 20,000 votes suppressed? I don't know. But the fact that any votes were suppressed in such a close election is concerning. And I think one of the things we have to do is take this out of just a political argument and just say, if you're trying to suppress people's votes, that is so morally disgusting. And when we have the President of the United States tweeting that he is going to suppress votes because he said tighten voting procedures. Well, everyone knows what that is. We have the President of the United States basically laying the groundwork for voter suppression. And to me, that's so outrageous. It should be a national scandal. It shouldn't just be thought of as a political story. It should really be, this is completely immoral in a democracy that this is happening.
So in every interview, I feel like I learned something. And I think that as you were explaining this phenomenon, Ari, it struck me that, of course, the answer is the same as it's always been, which is that the Democrats suck at fighting back. So you're right. What they should have done is said, voter suppression, voter suppression, voter suppression. And the way that they do it is so ineffectual. And then say, all right, let's have a debate as to what's more important, voter suppression or voter fraud. And I demand that the media give a real sense of the scope of these two different problems.
Well, I don't think you can just only blame the Democrats for this. I mean, these laws were passed by Republicans in Republican states by and large. I think the Democratic Party could be more outspoken on this. I'm hopeful that there are leaders coming up like Keith Ellison who have been very outspoken about denouncing this. I really think voting rights should be a central organizing principle for the party because if you don't have the right to vote, you can't solve any other issue. So what I was saying is there's lots of stuff that states are doing, primarily blue states, to make it easier to vote. Like in Oregon, they automatically register people. Like you go in, you get a driver's license, you renew your driver's license. They know you're an Oregon citizen. They know you're 18. They know you're a resident of the state. You don't have to say, I want to be registered. They're just going to register you. California's going to do this year. Every state could do this. We could register 60 million Americans like that. We could do lots of other stuff. We're not doing it because we're lacking for good ideas. We're not doing it because we're lacking the political will to implement those ideas.
So don't worry, Ari, I got it from here. Okay. So
it's all on you.
Yeah, we're gonna battle voter suppression, and we're not gonna let them get away with it. And so the reason I say Democrats are at fault, Ari, of course the Republicans are the ones pushing the legislation, but in the old media you'd have to explain that. In new media, everybody knows that already. It's just that we need people fighting back, and they've been so ineffectual in doing that. Okay, so let's talk about real quick the most important things to tackle on that issue.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned Oregon registering people automatically, but give me a couple other things that are the most common suppression tactics and how to fight back.
Well, voter ID laws are certainly one part of it. You have a situation where 5 to 10% of the electorate doesn't have strict forms of ID and have a tough time getting them. So you're talking about suppressing hundreds of thousands of votes in certain states. Things like cutting early voting, closing polling places. In North Carolina, they did this across the board, and there were dramatic decreases, particularly in areas like Greensboro. They had 16 early voting locations in 2012 for the first week of early voting. They had 1 in 2016. If there are longer lines, people are just going to say, I'm not going to bother. Unless you're a diehard, you might just decide you're not going to wait. Making it harder to register to vote, purging the voting rolls, disenfranchising ex-felons. So you've paid your debt to society and you still can't vote. These are all things that are being used nowadays.
Okay, and finally, I'm going to ask you a question that's too hard. Are you hopeful? Because I don't know how in this case, at least in the short term, it's possible to be hopeful. Like, how do you think you can galvanize enough people to fight back that gives us some degree of hope?
Well, the only thing that I'm hopeful about is that Trump's attacks on democracy are making people more mobilized about the need to protect our democracy. That people see Jeff Sessions going to the Justice Department and what's going to happen to the Supreme Court and how Trump's attacking an independent judiciary and all of these other things. They say we need to fight for this. And so, I talked to a lot of people about voting rights in 2015 and in 2016, and some people listened, but like the day after the election, all these people were tweeting at me like, oh, now we get it. And I'm like, okay, well, it would have been nice if we got it before it was too late, but I think this can really be one of the central organizing issues against Trump, which is the need to not just preserve our democracy, but to make it function a lot better.
Well, we'll end on that note, because I agree with you. It would have been nice to get people to care about voting before the election rather than after the election, but luckily it's before the 2018 election as we speak, and in fact there's some special elections out there right now, so we got to make sure, guys, no more voter suppression, not on our watch. That's a huge part of our democracy. Thank you, Ari.
Good to see you, man. Thank you.